Every Sunday at exactly 11:30, Margaret Hale carried the first bowl of chicken and dumplings out of the kitchen, but before she reached the counter, she always stopped beside the old coffee machine and wiped tears from her face. Nobody at the diner knew why, until one rainy Sunday, a customer took his first bite, slowly put down his spoon and whispered, "I know this recipe." Pause longer. If stories about the quiet kindness people carry for years mean something to you, stay with me, because Margaret's Sunday ritual had been hiding a story almost everyone had forgotten. Margaret Hale was 69 years old, and had worked in the kitchen of the Maple Street Diner for nearly 22 years. She arrived before sunrise most mornings. She tied her gray hair beneath a plain white scarf, buttoned an old blue apron around her waist, began preparing biscuits before most of the town had turned on its lights. Margaret wasn't unfriendly, but she wasn't particularly talkative either. She preferred the kitchen. She liked the sound of onions hitting a hot pan, the scrape of a wooden spoon against a pot, and the quiet rhythm of chopping vegetables. While the waitresses laughed near the coffee station, everyone at Maple Street respected her. But there was one thing nobody understood. Sunday, pause longer. Every other day, Margaret cooked whatever was on the diner menu, but on Sundays, she always insisted on making one additional dish herself: chicken and dumplings, nothing fancy, slow-cooked chicken, carrots, celery, onions, a little thyme and soft handmade dumplings, dropped into the broth one at a time. The owner had once suggested replacing them with something easier. Margaret simply looked at him and said, "Not on Sunday." So the dish stayed, and so did the tears. Pause longer. The younger employees noticed first, at around 11:30, when Margaret lifted the lid from the large silver pot, and the smell filled the kitchen. Her expression changed. Sometimes she would simply turn away. Sometimes she would press her fingers against the counter, and close her eyes, and sometimes a waitress would walk into the kitchen and find Margaret quietly wiping her cheeks with the edge of her apron. Nobody pushed her. They assumed it had something to do with her husband, Thomas. He had passed away several years earlier. Margaret rarely talked about him. Only once had she mentioned that Sunday had been his favorite day of the week. So the staff quietly decided, that must be the explanation. A woman missed her husband, a recipe reminded her of him, it made sense. Pause. But it wasn't the whole story, not even close. Pause longer. The customer who finally discovered the truth was named Daniel Mercer. He was 54. And had recently returned to town after spending most of his adult life elsewhere. Daniel wasn't wealthy, and he wasn't important. He worked repairing heating systems and small appliances. His hands were rough. His jacket had a permanently worn patch near one elbow. And he had the habit of thanking people twice, once when they helped him, and again before he left. Daniel had grown up nearby, but his family moved away when he was 13. He remembered pieces of the town, the old library, the railroad crossing, a playground that no longer existed. But Maple Street Diner had opened after his family left, so it meant nothing to him. That Sunday morning, Daniel came in simply because rain had started falling heavily, and he wanted somewhere warm to eat. He took a booth beside the window. A waitress handed him the menu. "What's good today?" he asked. She smiled. "Sunday?" Then she pointed toward a small chalkboard. "Margaret's chicken and dumplings." Daniel shrugged. "Sounds good." 10 minutes later, the bowl arrived, steam curled above the broth. Daniel broke one dumpling apart with his spoon, and took a bite. Pause. Then he stopped chewing. Pause longer. The waitress noticed. "Everything okay?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He took another spoonful, this time, slower. He tasted the broth, then a piece of dumpling. His eyes suddenly looked distant. Not unhappy. Just somewhere else. "Who made this?" he asked. "Our cook, Margaret." Daniel looked toward the kitchen doorway. "Margaret what?" "Hale." His spoon slipped quietly onto the edge of the bowl. "Could I talk to her?" The waitress hesitated. Margaret almost never came out during the lunch rush. But something in Daniel's face convinced her. A few minutes later, Margaret appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands on her apron. "You wanted to see me?" Daniel stood, for several seconds. He simply stared at her. Then he asked, "Did you ever cook at St. Andrew's Community Hall?" Longer. Margaret's face changed immediately. The room seemed to disappear around her. She looked at Daniel carefully. "That was a long time ago." "Sunday afternoons." Margaret nodded. Daniel looked down at the bowl. "The chicken and dumplings." Margaret stopped. How do you know about that? Daniel smiled, but his eyes had already begun filling with tears. Because when I was a kid. Longer. Daniel sat down again. Margaret slowly lowered herself into the booth across from him, and for the first time in years, she told someone at Maple Street the entire story. Long before she worked at the diner, Margaret and Thomas had volunteered at a small community meal program. They weren't in charge, they didn't have much money, they simply helped cook. Every Sunday, a few local families came through the hall for a warm lunch. Some were older people living alone. Some were parents going through difficult periods. Some brought children. Margaret wanted a meal that was inexpensive, filling, and comforting, so she began making her mother's chicken and dumplings. Thomas peeled vegetables. Margaret made the dumplings. And every Sunday, they cooked as much as the little kitchen could manage. Margaret never knew most of the children's names, but she remembered faces, wet coats hanging near the door, small hands wrapped around warm bowls, parents saying thank you quietly. Daniel had been one of those children. His mother had been raising 3 children largely on her own, during a difficult period. There were Sundays when she was exhausted, Daniel said. She'd tell us we were going somewhere special for lunch. Margaret lowered her eyes. Daniel smiled softly. I didn't understand what that place was. I just knew it smelled like this. Exactly like this. Longer. Margaret covered her mouth, Daniel continued. I used to ask my mother why we couldn't have those dumplings at home. Margaret laughed through her tears. What did she say? Daniel looked at her. She said some recipes only tasted right when somebody made them because they wanted you there. Longer. Margaret looked down. That sentence broke something open inside her. For years she had believed those Sundays had disappeared. The hall eventually closed its meal program, families moved away, Thomas grew older, life changed, and later, Thomas died. Pause. But Margaret kept making the recipe, every Sunday, not because it reminded her only of Thomas, but because Sunday morning was when she most clearly remembered the crowded little hall, the children, the coats, the bowls. Her husband standing beside her, peeling carrots, while pretending he was the better cook. I kept wondering what happened to everybody, Margaret admitted. All those children. Daniel looked at her. One of them is sitting right here. Pause longer. Margaret began crying again, but this time, she didn't turn away. Daniel reached across the table, and gently placed his hand over hers. You should know something. Margaret looked up. I remembered this meal for 40 years. She stared at him. Daniel glanced toward the kitchen. You probably thought you were just making lunch. He slowly shook his head. You were giving families one afternoon. When everything felt normal. Pause longer. Margaret squeezed his hand. Neither of them said anything for several moments. Around them, the diner continued moving. Coffee poured. Silverware clinked. Someone opened the front door. But at that booth, 2 people were sitting inside the same Sunday again. One, who had spent decades wondering whether a small kindness mattered. And one, who had carried the answer with him all along. Pause longer. Daniel returned the following Sunday. This time, he brought his wife. The Sunday after that, he brought his older sister. She remembered the dumplings too. Margaret cried when she saw her, but something was different. For the first time, the tears weren't followed by Margaret disappearing into the kitchen. She sat with them for several minutes. They told stories, they remembered the old community hall. Daniel's sister even remembered Thomas. The man who always gave children the biggest dumpling, she said. Margaret laughed. That sounds like him. Pause. Words slowly spread. Not through newspapers, not through television, just through people talkings. A customer heard the story, and quietly paid for an extra Sunday meal before leaving. The following week, somebody else did the same thing. The diner owner placed a small jar beside the register, no big sign, no campaign, just a handwritten card, Sunday table. Buy a meal for someone who could use one. Some weeks, there were 3 donated meals, sometimes 7, sometimes none. Nobody made a ceremony out of it. If someone needed one, they could simply ask. Margaret kept cooking the same recipe, chicken, carrots, celery, thyme, dumplings dropped carefully into the broth. But over the next several weeks, the staff noticed another change. At 11:30 on Sunday, Margaret still paused beside the coffee machine. Sometimes her eyes still became wet. Grief hadn't disappeared. Memories didn't work that way. Pause, but now. Daniel would sometimes be sitting in his booth, or his sister would wave through the kitchen doorway, or Margaret would see one of the prepaid meal tickets disappear from the board. And instead of turning away to hide her tears, Margaret smiled. Pause longer. One Sunday, a young waitress finally asked the question nobody had dared to ask before. "Margaret, why do you still make this every week?" Margaret looked toward the dining room. Daniel was helping an older customer carry a tray to a table. She smiled. "Because you never know who remembers being fed." Longer. Then she picked up the next bowl, and carried it out herself. Pause longer. Sometimes, the kindness we barely remember giving, becomes a memory someone else carries for a lifetime. If this story touched you, comment, "Kindness lives here," and if there was ever a meal, a person, or a small act of kindness from your childhood that you still remember today, share that memory in the comments. Someone who once wondered whether their kindness mattered may need to read it.